Do you know that slavery in ancient Africa existed long before European and Arab traders arrived on the scene? Today, Black Stories Untold brings to you the critical differences between two forms of slavery: domestic slavery, deeply rooted in African society, and the more terrifying, dehumanizing chattel slavery brought by European and Arab traders. Join us as we explore how these systems shaped African history and the painful legacy of chattel slavery that still resonates today. Stay tuned, subscribe, and let's uncover the untold truths together. Slavery has been a part of human societies for thousands of years, and it was no different in Africa, where various forms of servitude existed long before European colonization and the transatlantic slave trade. However, the nature of slavery in ancient African societies was markedly different from the form of slavery that developed during and after European involvement. The two primary forms of slavery in ancient Africa were domestic slavery and chattel slavery, both of which were deeply embedded in African socio-economic and political structures, but functioned under very different terms and with varying degrees of severity. To understand the origins of slavery in Africa and the differences between domestic and chattel slavery, it is essential to explore the historical context in which these practices evolved, the role of African societies in managing slaves, and the eventual transformation of slavery under external influences such as the Arab and European slave trades. Slavery in Africa can be traced back to ancient times, long before European colonization. African societies were complex, with well-established kingdoms, city-states, and smaller tribal communities, each having distinct social structures. In many of these societies, slavery was a deeply ingrained institution that played a significant role in the economic and political fabric. The origins of slavery in Africa are often linked to warfare, debt, punishment for crimes, and kinship systems. For instance, in many African societies, individuals who were captured during warfare were taken as slaves. These slaves could be integrated into the household of their captors or sold to other families. In some instances, individuals who could not pay their debts or those convicted of crimes were forced into slavery as a means of restitution. Additionally, some forms of servitude were tied to kinship obligations, where weaker groups or individuals submitted themselves to more powerful families or leaders in exchange for protection or economic support. Domestic slavery, also referred to as indigenous or household slavery, was the more common form of servitude in ancient African societies. This type of slavery was fundamentally different from the chattel slavery that became predominant during the transatlantic slave trade. In domestic slavery, slaves were typically integrated into the household of their masters and were expected to perform various tasks, including farming, herding, domestic chores, and even administrative roles in some cases. Unlike chattel slavery, where slaves were considered the absolute property of their owners, domestic slaves in Africa often enjoyed a degree of social mobility and protection. In many cases, they were treated as part of the family and had some rights. Domestic slaves could marry, own property, and even ascend to positions of influence within their master's household. It was not uncommon for slaves to eventually gain their freedom through various means, such as manumission or integration into the family structure. Domestic slavery was also tied to Africa's complex systems of kinship and social hierarchy. In some societies, slaves were considered clients of their masters, meaning they had reciprocal obligations to each other. While slaves owed labor and loyalty to their masters, the masters were expected to provide protection, food, and clothing for their slaves. This system of mutual obligation distinguished domestic slavery from the more exploitative forms of slavery seen in other parts of the world. Furthermore, domestic slavery in Africa was often not hereditary. The children of slaves were not automatically enslaved, and in many cases, they could be born free. This contrasts sharply with the European model of chattel slavery, where slaves were considered the property of their owners and passed down through generations. One of the best examples of domestic slavery can be seen in the Kingdom of Ghana and the Mali Empire. In these powerful West African kingdoms, domestic slaves were used to manage large estates, serve in royal courts, and even fight in armies. While these slaves had no personal freedom, they were often well treated and held in relatively high regard within the social hierarchy. Chattel slavery, by contrast, was a much harsher and dehumanizing form of servitude. In this system, slaves were considered the absolute property of their owners, much like livestock or personal belongings. Chattel slaves had no rights, no social mobility, and were subjected to harsh labor conditions. This form of slavery treated individuals as commodities to be bought, sold, and traded without regard for their humanity. While chattel slavery was not the predominant form of slavery in ancient Africa, it did exist, particularly in regions where external influences like the Arab and European slave trades took root. Chattel slavery became more common as African societies began to engage in long-distance trade with Arab and European merchants. The demand for slaves in foreign markets, particularly in the Middle East and later in the Americas, led to the growth of a commercialized form of slavery that was more akin to the chattel slavery practiced in other parts of the world. The development of chattel slavery in Africa was closely tied to the trans-Saharan and transatlantic slave trades. As Arab traders expanded their influence across North and East Africa in the 7th century, they introduced new systems of slavery that were more exploitative and focused on the mass exportation of human beings. African rulers and merchants began to capture and sell slaves to Arab traders, who then transported them across the Sahara to markets in the Middle East. Many of these slaves were treated as chattel, forced to work in harsh conditions on plantations or as servants in wealthy households. The introduction of chattel slavery in Africa reached its peak during the transatlantic slave trade, which began in the 15th century and lasted until the 19th century. European demand for labor to work on sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations in the Americas led to the capture and exportation of millions of Africans. The transatlantic slave trade radically transformed the nature of slavery in Africa, turning what had once been a relatively flexible and fluid system of domestic slavery into a brutal, dehumanizing institution focused on profit and exploitation. Domestic versus chattel slavery. Key differences. 1. In domestic slavery, slaves were often integrated into the household and treated as part of the extended family, with certain rights and social mobility. In contrast, chattel slavery treated slaves as absolute property, with no rights or recognition of their humanity. 2. Domestic slavery was typically not hereditary, meaning that the children of slaves were often born free. In chattel slavery, the status of the slave was passed down through generations, with children automatically inheriting their parents' enslaved status. 3. Domestic slaves often had some degree of freedom, such as the ability to marry, own property, and eventually gain their freedom. Chattel slaves, however, had no rights or freedoms and were subjected to harsh labor conditions and cruel treatment. 4. Domestic slavery in Africa was characterized by the integration of slaves into the social and economic fabric of the household. Chattel slavery, on the other hand, commodified human beings, treating them as goods to be bought, sold and traded. 5. Domestic slaves in Africa played an important role in the social, political and economic life of their communities. They were often trusted advisors, warriors, or managers of estates. In chattel slavery, slaves were reduced to mere laborers with no role beyond their economic exploitation. 6. In many African societies, domestic slaves could eventually gain their freedom through various means, such as manumission, marriage, or integration into the family structure. In chattel slavery, freedom was almost impossible, and slaves were trapped in a perpetual cycle of servitude. The Arab and European slave trades had a profound impact on African societies and the institution of slavery. The Arab slave trade, which predated the transatlantic slave trade, introduced new forms of slavery that were more commercialized and exploitative. Arab traders captured and exported millions of Africans to markets in the Middle East, where they were sold as chattel slaves. The transatlantic slave trade, however, had the most significant impact on African slavery. European demand for slaves to work on plantations in the Americas led to the capture and exportation of millions of Africans. African rulers and merchants, seeking to profit from the lucrative slave trade, began to capture and sell slaves to European traders in exchange for guns, textiles, and other goods. This massive exportation of slaves had devastating consequences for African societies. Entire communities were torn apart, and the demographic impact of the slave trade was immense. The loss of millions of young men and women severely weakened African economies and political structures, making them more vulnerable to European colonization in the 19th century. The transatlantic slave trade also fundamentally changed the nature of slavery in Africa. As African rulers and merchants became more involved in the commercial slave trade, domestic slavery increasingly gave way to chattel slavery. The demand for slaves in foreign markets led to the mass commodification of human beings, and the brutal conditions of the transatlantic slave trade further dehumanized African slaves. The origins of slavery in Africa are complex and deeply rooted in the continent's social, political, and economic history. While domestic slavery was the predominant form of servitude in ancient African societies, chattel slavery became more common as external influences, such as the Arab and European slave trades, took hold. The differences between domestic and chattel slavery are stark, with domestic slavery being more flexible and integrated into African social structures, while chattel slavery was exploitative and dehumanizing. The legacy of slavery in Africa continues to shape the continent's history, and understanding the distinctions between domestic and chattel slavery is crucial to understanding the broader history of the African diaspora and the impact of the slave trade on African societies. Thank you for watching. We'd love to hear from you. Share with us where you're watching from in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more powerful insights into our history. Like, comment and share this video with others to help spread these important stories. Before you go, here's a question for you. Did you know that domestic slavery in Africa was different from chattel slavery, or is this new to you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.